Hey, what's up, everyone? Recently, I did a series of videos where I modded my Willy Wonka pinball machine, and if you saw that series, you may recall that I ran into a problem with one of my mods where this 3D printed part, this pipe, had broke on me. If you missed it, here's a clip from that video. It's been a couple days, I have to admit. A couple days, I was waiting to get this as a replacement. This is actually another pipe, so MesoMod sent me a new one, and the reason for that is the original broke on me. And mostly my fault, I'm pretty darn sure. But what happened was I played a long game on here. I got a lot of multi-balls, a lot of balls were traveling down this railing, down this ramp. And afterwards, I came back and I noticed that this pipe had come just slightly out of the factory, and I didn't have it very far in there to begin with. But it had come just far enough that there was a little bit of a gap and it was a little bit off center. So I was just going to thread it right back in there. And I must have just put too much pressure on the left side, or something was off, and crunch. The whole left side just snapped right off where the tension is. And so I needed a replacement. And here's actually the original. So if you look here, I glued this back together, but you can see where it cracked. It cracked right along this line here. And I glued it back together, not because I was going to try to put it back on there, because there's no way that this would go back on here. It just isn't strong enough anymore. I lost too much of that integrity. But I glued it back together because I do have a possible plan for this. I might see if I can make a mold of it. So although I have a replacement part and don't need another, I still thought it would be worth trying to make a replica merely as an experiment. And using a silicone mold sounded most appealing to me because A, it's relatively inexpensive, and B, it's a fairly simple process. And on top of everything else, it just sounds like a fun project. You know, there's not a lot of money or pressure riding on it, so it just seemed like a fun little experiment to try. Anyhow, I set up a couple cameras, and this is how the process went. Okay, so I'm going to do the best I can to narrate through this. I apologize if I stumble or fumble, but hopefully this will make some sense to you guys. So what I'm doing here is just getting ready to do the first half of the silicone mold. So early on, I decided that the best approach to doing this mold would be to do it in two halves. And that's mostly because this part, this 3D printed part, doesn't have a good flat surface. I can't just put it at the bottom of my box here and pour silicone over it. I need to capture every detail around it. So doing it in two halves allows me to do that and is a fairly simple process. So what I'm doing here is laying clay in, and that'll allow me to basically make a clay bed and allow me to mount my 3D printed part into that clay so it doesn't move around when I pour the silicone over it. And the box that I'm using here is just something I slapped together. The guide that I follow recommends using like an acrylic or plexiglass, and I had some extra 1/8-inch sheets of plexiglass laying around. So I just cut them up and I made this 6-inch by 6-inch box. So it is very thin plexiglass. It's only 1/8 inch thick. If I had something thicker laying around, I probably would have used that because it was a little bit tricky, but it's just hot glued together. And then underneath it is an old beat up arcade marquee that I've used for various projects. And I just threw that underneath here because I needed a smooth, flat surface. So I'm just continuing to build this bed of clay up until it's about half the height of my part, because you want to have, two equal halves of silicone for the mold. But this clay is actually pretty interesting stuff. It's called Sculptex clay. It's a sculpting clay, as the name implies. But it's one of the brands that was recommended in the guide. But it's a very soft clay. It's very inexpensive too. And it doesn't contain any sulfur, so it also doesn't harden. And so you can use this clay over and over again. And I kept all my clay. I bought way more than I needed to. But luckily, it is relatively inexpensive in that regard. But anyways, I'm just going through and I'm continuing to smooth everything out. The guide recommended having the clay as smooth as possible. You don't want any like air pockets or anything like that where the silicone could pour into. So that's what I'm doing here, and that's why I've got these pottery tools, just to kind of level everything out and get it as, as good as I can. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but you want it to be as smooth as possible. So now I've got these, they're called acorn nuts. You can buy them at any hardware store. I think they're also called cap nuts. And the purpose for these is you want to set these into the clay, and what they're going to do is once you pour the silicone over them, it's going to go around these cap nuts, and when you do the other side, it's going to fill into those holes as well. And so basically they're providing a key. And what that means is that you've got these two pieces of silicone, you've got the top and the bottom half. And by having these acorn nuts in there to provide a key, it allows you to take both halves and mate them together perfectly. So there's no real room for error. Because if you didn't do that, you can imagine it would be really challenging to get both of those halves to line up just perfectly and not be misaligned. So these just make it easy to do that. And it's a very simple method for doing that. So now I'm all done there, and it's time to mix together our silicone. And I bought this stuff off of Smooth On. You can see the name on the cups there, smooth-on.com. And they specialize in this type of stuff, the silicone mold, just molding in general. So it comes in two halves. One half is this yellow container here. It's this real thick, gummy white stuff. and then the other stuff in the blue container is the other half. And it's blue. So you mix these two together, just like you would with paint. And it is very, very thick stuff. And it's a little tricky to get every last drop out of these containers. That's why I have everything kind of time-lapsed here. But pour these two together, and then you just use a painting stick, basically, and make sure it's really, really thoroughly mixed. And that's your silicone. This stuff takes a long time to cure. It takes about 6 hours for it to cure. And in hindsight, if I had known, I would have probably tried to make a smaller box. I made that 6-inch by 6-inch box was a bit generous. And if I had made a smaller box, which would have worked just fine, it would have saved me some money on materials, because I ended up having to use more silicone than I anticipated. But it's not terribly expensive. I think one batch of this stuff's like $25. So here we're getting ready to do the first top half, or the first half. And the guide recommends just pouring the stuff into one corner and laying it kind of self-level. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm actually going to pour it into the lowest corner once I figure that out. And so you can see how it goes over those acorn nuts, and that's going to cause it to make a print. And that'll be our female side, I guess. So originally I thought I'd only need one batch for the top here, and obviously I needed some more. And again, I've got everything time-lapsed here. It gets to be a little bit monotonous. So that's going to cure. That's going to take 6 hours to cure. And then when we come back, we can do the other half. Okay, so 6 hours has passed, and the first half of my mold has cured. And so what I need to do now is disassemble my box so that I can get to it and remove the clay. So I'm just using this utility knife here, basically to cut through the hot glue and the Gorilla Tape I used to reinforce all of the sides here. Now this silicone, I don't think I really talked much about it, but this is called the Mold Star 30. And it's a little bit more robust, more rugged than the 15, which is a lot more flexible. But I spoke to one of the representatives at Smooth On asking what would be best for the part that I'm trying to take a mold of, and this is what he recommended. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still very flexible stuff, but it is a little bit more robust than the 15, and which is kind of what I wanted, because I'm using a pretty heavy-duty urethane to cast this part. So here I'm having a little bit of trouble to flipping this around. There we go. So what I need to do now is remove all of the clay from the other half, and then we can do the second part of the mold. So a little bit of a messy process here. A little tedious too. I think I have this time lapsed. Yeah. Yeah, just pulling off all this clay. And this, like I said, I saved all this clay. There's no reason to throw it out. But probably the challenging part of this, and tedious, I should say, was removing a clay that is directly on and inside and around the 3D printed part. Just because it's a weird shape and because of the hollow nature of it, getting all those little fragments of clay out of there was a real pain in the ass. And you really do need to remove every little speck and fragment because you don't want any remnants of clay on there, especially on the 3D printed part itself. Because when you pour that silicone over there, if there is clay, you're going to screw up the mold. And so you can see me going through with all these little tiny tools and brushes and just working really hard to get every little speck of clay out of there. It is a time consuming process, but it's definitely required. But now we need to remove all these acorn nuts, and you can see the prints that they're making inside the mold, or the prints that they made inside the mold. I guess you could call this the female part of the mold, or the female half, because once we pour the clay over there, that will create those inverse prints, or the positive or the negative side of it. So I'm just going through with the brush, just once again making sure that there is absolutely no clay there. So now we get to reassemble the plexiglass box that I made early on. And this was a bit trickier because since it is such a thin type of plexiglass, I was starting to realize the weakness to using a really thin plexiglass like this, because it is so flexible that the actual first half of that silicone kind of bowed out the sides, and you can see that there is a little bit of a gap in that corner there, and that will pose a problem later on that you'll see. But for now, I'm just reassembling this box, and again using some Gorilla Tape just to reinforce it while I hot glue all of the edges. And the first time I glued this together, I actually glued the inside and the outside, but because we now have half of the mold, I can't really do that, or do the inside, I should say. So before we can um, pour the second half of the silicone in there, we need to use something called, this is called ease release. And basically its purpose is so that we are able to break apart both pieces of silicone, both halves of that mold, because without this, the silicone is going to bond to that lower half of silicone, and you're just going to end up with a solid piece of silicone that you can't separate without cutting in half. So this is, I guess you could call it kind of a lubricant, or some sort of sealant. I don't know. My mind's drawing a blank here, but it just prevents the second half of the silicone from bonding with this one. So the instructions have you, like I just did, spray a generous amount on, and then take a brush and just kind of brush it all around and make sure that everything's evenly coated, and then do another coat of it. So I'll grab it here, and another generous amount of this ease release. This stuff is pretty magical. I don't know what the properties of it are, but it does work quite well. So now we can mix together our next batch of silicone and do the same thing. But actually, I'm getting ahead of the game here. Forgot about this part. So you can see me rolling up a little piece of clay here. What I'm doing is basically making a pour spigot. So we need to have a hole to pour the urethane, the cast into. So that's what this is going to serve the purpose of. And I'm just making sure that it's large enough, but it will also stick to this leg of the part. And then that will stick out the top of our second half of the mold. And we can just pull that out after it's cured, and that will be where we pour the resin, the urethane, in. Yeah, I got a little bit lucky that the 3D printed part had any sort of a little bit of a flat surface on these, I guess you could call them legs. And then I'm going to do a second one here, and this one's a lot skinnier, but its only purpose is basically to allow air to escape. So that will prevent bubbles, or help prevent bubbles, once we pour the urethane in. Like so. Yeah, that should do. So now we get to repeat the process and mix together our next batch of silicone. Same exact way we did before. That's why it's all time-lapsed here. And in it goes. Now you will see the problem that I was talking about with that thin plexiglass and just the nature of it. Because those panels don't hug around the bottom half perfectly, you can see it seeping out the bottom corner there. So there was a little bit of a pocket. And so that silicone, that top half, some of it got around the bottom half. And that will bond because that doesn't have any air release on there. Anyhow, 6 hours later, it's going to cure. And here we are, done. Now, I didn't know that was going to be a problem, but you will see how that pans out here. So again, I got to break away all these panels of the box. Just cutting through the hot glue again. And here is our complete mold. So the first thing that we're going to do is trim the flash. I think that's what they call it. Just trim the excess, the little bit of excess around the corners and everywhere. Now this is still, I still think that everything's cool, and this is just going to break apart in two halves. But after this, then we need to remove our clay here. And I had a little bit of a problem with this skinny one, but I was able to dig it out using some pottery tools here. Just get our clay out of there, our pour spigot and the air hole. So now I'm realizing that that silicone that started to leak actually bonded to the bottom half on the sides. So what I end up doing here, or decide to do after I realize that I absolutely cannot separate these two pieces, is grab my utility knife. But yeah, it is really bonded on there, and that's how much of a difference that air release makes, or if you don't have it. So I'm just cutting a really thin layer off, just getting that excess silicone that bonded off there so that I can break these two pieces apart. And I guess that's partially, I guess I got a little bit lucky in that I made this, made the box larger than it needed to be. So I don't have to worry about cutting out a vital part of the mold. So you can see on all the sides, it doesn't look pretty anymore. I shaved off some of that, but I'm able to break it free here. But again, this is a little bit tricky because it is a hollow part. So there is silicone that's inside the part, but because it's so flexible, I'm able to pry that out. Almost got it here. Just takes a little bit of elbow grease. I am a little paranoid, but about breaking something, but this stuff is really resilient. And there we go. And it's really durable and flexible. So that's the top half. And here's our, I'm just inspecting it here, but now I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to just pull, or, remove this part. But that, again, that silicone is so flexible. It's amazing. It doesn't seem like it's that flexible, but it is. And I'm able to just pull our part out. So there's the original. And here's our two halves of the mold all ready to go. And now you can see the purpose behind those acorn nuts. So there's only one way to attach both of these halves now that we've done that. I'm just going through there and just cleaning everything up, seeing if there's any debris or remains of clay. But all in all, it turned out pretty well. It does look a bit crude because of having to shave off a little bit of the silicone, but it should serve the purpose just fine. And again, yeah, just making sure there's nothing stuck in there, so that when we pour the resin in there, it's going to make a perfect cast. And that's what we get to do now. That's the fun part. So this is just like the silicone. This comes in two parts, and it's very clear, just straight up liquid. Unlike the silicone that was much thicker, this is pretty thin. But the big difference between this stuff is that, well, here I'm pouring a little bit too much. It's hard to, I didn't really know exactly how much I needed, but it mixes into two parts. This is the 65D urethane. But the interesting thing about this, what I was going to say, is that the silicone takes 6 hours to cure, so quite a while. This stuff takes like 15 minutes tops. It cures really quick. So as soon as I start pouring this stuff together, it's kind of like you're on the clock. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting about this that I did not anticipate, because I don't even think the directions said anything about it, but when you pour these together, this stuff gets warm. It gets almost hot. And I didn't know that. Afterwards, after I was done and I had some excess urethane in my mixing cup here, I grabbed it and it was like holding a cup of hot chocolate. I was really surprised. So this stuff, after it's all mixed up, after it cures, will turn white. And so obviously we'll need to paint the part, the replica, once it's done. And again, you can see I've got some safety glasses on and my chemical resistant gloves, which are highly recommended in the instructions. So I'm not going to risk that, not using any of those safety precautions. All right, so now we're on the clock. I think it says 10 to 15 minutes for it to cure, which I guess is kind of nice because you don't have to wait very long, but it's a little bit nerve-wracking. So you can see both pieces mate just perfectly together. And we should be all set to go. So now it's just a matter of pouring in our cast. Being pretty darn careful. So I'm just going to let the air get in there and let it settle, and then pour a little bit more in there. And again, I didn't really know how much to make for something like this, especially since it's hollow, but I probably made twice as much as I really needed. And I definitely have a lot left. So what I'm doing here is I'm just putting one of the panels of my plexiglass over it, and they recommend slowly turning the mold up and down and rotating it just to, it looks like a bit of a dance here, just to prevent any air bubbles, any bubbles from forming. So that's pretty much all there is to it. And then we get to wait about 15 minutes or so for it to cure. And now you can see that it's fully cured. That urethane is very, very solid. And so we can start removing the mold, which is easier said than done because that urethane also cures all the way up into the pour spigot and that air hole. So I was a little bit paranoid about if whether or not I was going to break something. Ultimately, I end up grabbing a screwdriver just to hold that down, just to press that down so I can remove the top here. And that did the trick. And this stuff is really strong. I was pretty surprised. So far, so good. And then removing this thing, pretty much we can just pull it out like we did with the original part. And out it pops, and voila, not bad. I was actually surprised at some of the detail it captured, even like the 3D printed the layers. It captured all of those little details. And this is really strong stuff. I mean, this urethane, you could think of it as the same type of urethane, maybe like in a bowling ball. It's really tough. In fact, this is a stronger part now than the original 3D printed part. But there is a little bit of flex to it. You can buy different types of urethane, obviously, and this has a little bit of flex to it. So right now, it's just a matter of shaving off the remainder, the pore spigot that bonded or that cured. So I'm just going to use a Dremel here and just shave that off. Any chance I have to use a Dremel, I don't know what it is. I love using this tool. And there that goes. So a little bit of sanding and we should be done with this. A little bit of fine tuning. But yeah, looking pretty snazzy. So one thing cool about this mold now, the silicone mold, is it's since it's done, you can just keep recasting it. So if I needed 100 of these parts, well, I could use that mold 100 times. So pretty darn straightforward and simple. The hardest part is making the mold, at least in my experience. So right now I'm just going through with a sanding block here, just sanding off any of the rough edges. That's what I was doing with the little X-Acto knife a second ago there too. But yep, just smoothing out any rough stuff, which there really wasn't much of. So there is our replica. Obviously, it needs to be painted yet, and I also need to put the danger decal on there, which you'll see in a little bit later here. So here's a little comparison. Here's the original, and the red is the original, and then our replica, and they are pretty much 1 to 1. Not too bad. I was actually really surprised. I was expecting there to be more problems, especially for a first time experiment. So let's get this thing painted. Oh, and you can also see that it got, those little studded pieces too. It wasn't absolutely perfect, but pretty darn close. So here I am outside, and I'm just painting this. I couldn't find an exact match of red. I found something close, but just out on my balcony, throwing a few coats on here. So I sped this all up. It's just, monotonous stuff. But I ended up putting like 3 or 4 coats on, waiting some time in between. This is like the third or fourth coat here. Then I think I flip it around. Yep. And that should just about do it. So now we've got them side by side. The replicas on the right, originals on the left there. Looking pretty darn good. Again, you can kind of tell that the original is a little bit more on the orangish side, but not bad. So here's my danger decal that I had pulled off the original because I was going to reuse it. So I just need to super glue that on here. And that should be the end of this. Nothing too fancy here.
Not bad, if I do say so myself. So here's a comparison with the one that's in my pinball machine right now in my Wonka, side by side. Not bad, huh? I gotta say I'm pretty happy with this. So now if I break 100 of these, which hopefully I don't, or even break another one, I've got a mold I can use. So anyhow, hopefully that wasn't too boring. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.